This is Wayne Eberly, pastor of the Dunn's Corners Church. This sermon is for Mother's Day, and it's a story from Luke chapter 7 where a woman has lost her son, her only son, and on top of that, she's a widow. We're told when Jesus saw her son being carried out to be buried, he said to her, "Don't cry." Then he went up to the coffin where they were carrying him, and the bearer stood still. Jesus said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There's a phrase in the Psalms that's meant to convey God's awesomeness, how God is not limited by time. The psalmist says, "For 1,000 years are in your sight, are like a day that is just gone by." Well, the second letter of Peter taps into that eternal truth. People are growing weary, waiting for the return of Jesus, and Peter says to them, "Friends, don't forget that with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day." Now, wouldn't you know it, some jokester took this eternal truth and made a joke out of it, and it's a joke about a preacher. Why is it always got to be about the preacher? A preacher went to his church. He was praying to God. While he was praying to God, he asked, "God, how long is 10 million years to you?" God said, "A second." Next day, the preacher asked God, "God, how much is $10 million to you?" God replied, "A penny." Third day, the preacher comes and stands before God, and he says, "God, can I have one of your pennies?" And God said, "Wait a second." Wait a second. On this Mother's Day, which unfortunately for many is a virtual Mother's Day, maybe not in person, we're presented in the Gospel of Luke with a mother who's had her heart ripped out. Jesus is entering a town called Nain. He encounters a dead person being carried out, presumably to be buried. We're told the dead person is the only son of his mother, and we're told his mother is a widow. She lost her husband, now she lost her only son. For all the mothers who've ever had their heart ripped out in all the ways a mother's heart can be ripped out, including the heart-wrenching agony of losing a child, in this case, an only son. For all the mothers who've had their heart ripped out, we're told this about Jesus. His heart went out to her. And this is what Jesus did not say to that mourning mother. Jesus did not say, "Wait a second." No, instead Jesus said, "Don't cry." And then he set about doing a miracle. As soon as Jesus saw the dead person and the devastated mother, he said, "Don't cry." Then he said to the son, "Get up." When the son did get up and was raised from the dead, Jesus gave him back to his mother. For every mother who knows the immense pain of having your heart ripped out, this story is for you. Jesus sees your sadness. His heart goes out to you. He cries, "Get up!" And when the sun rises, he hands him back to his mother. And he never once says, "Wait a second." From his baptism in the Jordan River to his death on the cross, it's pretty clear the ministry of Jesus lasted about 3 years. All the marvelous miracles he did happened in the space of about 3 years. To do this, Jesus did not spend a lot of time telling people, "Wait a second." There's a phrase that commentators have noticed appears often in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the 3 Gospels that see things together. And it's the word immediately. Now, the Bible doesn't always move immediately. The Bible's comfortable with a slow pace. Abraham and Sarah, when they're waiting for Isaac to be born, It takes years and years and years. When the people of Israel are in slavery in Egypt, it feels like it's going to last forever. They wander in the wilderness 4 decades. It's something like 200 centuries from the time of Abraham to the time of Jesus. And that's not even talking about a guy like Methuselah who lived 969 years. The Bible's comfortable with the slow pace. And then when Jesus appears, the pace picks up. The word immediately appears in the Bible 54 times. 33 of those times are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You see, there's not much wait a second in the Gospels. Immediately, disciples leave their nets and their boats. Jesus reaches out his hand to the leper, and he's made clean immediately. On the storm-tossed sea, frightened disciples see a stranger walking on the water. Immediately, Jesus says to them, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." When Peter leapt out of the boat and tried to walk on the water only to sink, Jesus immediately rescued him. When he touched the eyes of the blind, they received sight immediately. A woman's bleeding stopped immediately. And when Jesus saw the dead son of the widow from Nain, her only son, being taken out to be buried, Jesus did not say to her, "Wait a second." Jesus acted immediately. In just the few verses of the passage, he says, "Don't cry." He says, "Get up." And he hands the boy, now living, back to his mother. Not once in the whole narrative does Jesus say, "Wait a second." What's not to like in this story? What's not to like in this story where Jesus acts immediately? What's not to like in the story? If we're honest, it becomes painfully obvious what's not to like in the story. You see, in our lives, there are critical moments, crucial moments, the moments of the greatest concern. And we come to God in those moments. We come to Jesus in those moments. Our greatest concern, our greatest struggle. And for all the world, it feels like Jesus says, "Wait a second." We pour our hearts out to God for healing, for relief, for reconciliation. And when we lose a loved one, yes, we pray for resurrection. And for all the world, it feels like Jesus says, "Wait a second." For many, that second ends up stretching a lifetime. A child remains dead. A relationship remains broken. A dream remains crushed. A hope remains unfulfilled. We wait a second, and the second stretches on. Is Jesus ever going to answer my prayer? Is Jesus ever going to heal my brokenness? Is he ever going to bind up the wound? Is Jesus ever going to make what's wrong right? The story of the widow of Nain is in Luke chapter 7. Up to Luke chapter 7, Jesus has been doing a whole lot of good. And he's been doing a whole lot of good immediately. Right after this story, John the Baptist is going to get a report about the work Jesus is doing. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are made clean, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is preached to the poor. Through the first 7 chapters in Luke, Jesus is doing a lot of good, and he's doing it immediately. Then in Luke chapter 9, there's a subtle shift, but the shift is extremely important. In Luke chapter 9, we're told that as the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out toward Jerusalem. He set his face toward Jerusalem. When Jesus resolutely sets his face toward Jerusalem, we can almost imagine him saying to all of those immediate needs that surround him and confront him, we can almost imagine Jesus saying to all those immediate and urgent needs, "Wait a second." He doesn't say, wait a second, because those needs are not important. Rather, when Jesus says, wait a second, he says it because he realizes the only answer to all the urgent and immediate needs is for him to go to the cross. That's why Jesus says to those immediate needs, wait a second. He's going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to go to the cross. And his suffering and his death are going to be the means for God to take all of those immediate needs, those urgent needs, all of the things in life that are broken. When Jesus goes to the cross, he brings healing. He brings wholeness. It's at the cross that all the sadness, the suffering, the death, and the dying is overcome. So Jesus looks at the immediate needs in Luke 9 and says, wait a second. And he sets out toward the cross to fix things, and to fix things for all eternity. And he does. Boy, does he ever fix things for all eternity. You read a chapter like Revelation 21. There's a new heaven and a new earth. And it's brought to us by none other than the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who's also the Lamb that was slain. And, well, that's Jesus. Jesus brings a new heaven and a new earth. When Jesus says, wait a second, and he goes to the cross, he answers every prayer we could have ever prayed about every sadness, every sorrow, every suffering, and every pain. Wait a second. I'm going to the cross. I'm going to fix it all. And boy, does he fix it all. Revelation 21 tells us one day we'll be with God, and God will be with us. There will be no more death, no more mourning, no more crying, and no more pain. All those old things will pass away. It seems like we have two good options today. Option one, Jesus acts immediately. The boy is raised, he hands him back to his mother. That's option one. Option two, Jesus says, wait a second. And in God's good timing, one day that boy will be restored with his mother, and they'll enjoy eternity in new creation, where there's no more sadness, no more suffering, no more sorrow, and no more pain. Option one is wonderful. Option two is wonderful. But option two also presents us with a dilemma. And the dilemma is, how do we live when God says, wait a second? And that second feels like such a long time. How do we live when our hearts have been ripped out, when our dreams have been dashed? How do we live when Jesus says, wait a second? And he's going to make all things right in eternity. I wonder if the widow of Nain can help us in our waiting. You see, there's something in her story that no matter what would never change. When Jesus sees the woman weeping over her dead son, we're told his heart went out to her. Now, Jesus knows he's going to raise the son immediately, but still, when he sees her weeping, his heart goes out to her. I mean to tell you, if Jesus had told her, wait a second, don't you know his heart would have still gone out to her? Jesus knows how hard it is to be human, how hard it is to suffer loss. Jesus, his heart would go out to her in an even greater way, knowing that he was going to have to tell her, wait a second, and she was going to go through that period of loss. Jesus cares for us. He cares so deeply, he goes to Jerusalem to die for us. When Jesus says, wait a second, his heart goes out to us. That would be exactly the same when he says, wait a second. But I also think there's something in the story that would be different if Jesus said, wait a second. Something would change. If Jesus said, wait a second, you know, Jesus says to the weeping widow, don't cry. Why? Because because her son's going to be raised immediately. What if the son wasn't going to be raised immediately? What if Jesus said, wait a second? I don't think he would have told that weeping widow, don't cry. Jesus is not afraid of tears. Jesus is not ashamed of tears. When a weeping woman bathed his feet with her tears, he didn't say, don't cry. When he was at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, Jesus himself cried. Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Wait a second. When Jesus says, wait a second, I don't think he tells us, don't cry. I think when he says, wait a second, he comes right alongside us. He comes near to us. He holds us close. I think Jesus wraps his arms of love around us and he whispers words of comfort, of kindness, of care and concern. I think Jesus weeps with us. He shares our sorrow. He mingles his tears with our tears. Wait a second. It's just down the road. It might feel like eternity, but in God's time it's just a second and all things will be made right, and they'll be made right for all time. And while you wait, while we wait, know this, we never wait alone. Jesus has come to be with us. His heart goes out to us. His tears mingle with our tears. Wait a second. And while we wait, know that the Lord is with us, crying with us until that great day when every tear is dried. Amen.